Hey there, darling. Welcome to the Farmer's Table. My name is Jess. I'm so happy to have you here in my kitchen with me today, where I'm going to share with you what would be my secret recipe if I had a secret recipe. Today I'm going to show you my process for making chicken and dumplings. Now, I am a Southern girl, born and raised, you may be able to tell, and chicken and dumplings are kind of like a staple on a Southern menu. It is the epitome of comfort food to me. Now, my version of chicken and dumplings has evolved over the years. I think that I probably made chicken and dumplings for the first time 20 years ago or something like that. And by necessity and tweaking and changing for dietary reasons and all that stuff, I've kind of come to the place and how I make chicken and dumplings now. And I must say, they're very good for chicken and dumplings. Now, I will disclose, chicken and dumplings are one of those like North versus South food situations where it can be done very differently depending on the region where you live. In the more northern places, what chicken and dumplings typically are kind of like biscuit dumplings. They're fluffier, the inside of them is breadier, and they kind of float on top of what's more or less like a chicken soup. Southern chicken and dumplings are typically more like noodle dumplings, what we would say, where there's a dough that you roll out on the counter and you cut it into like strips and you cook it in, and it becomes more like gravy-ish where you have the chicken and the dumplings. The way that I do it is a little bit of a hybrid between the two. I grew up with noodle dumplings, being Southern. When I married my husband, his family, a lot of his family's from Indiana, and the way his mom always made chicken and dumplings was with like Bisquick mix and then dropping the biscuit dumplings in. And he really liked the bready inside. I really liked kind of like the gravy-ish, thicker consistency with the more dense dumplings. And so I kind of married the two, and I'll show you what it is that I do. For full disclosure also, I kind of hate cleaning up messes. And so my method of dumplings was not necessarily like really trying to like marry and honor North and South and different styles and blah, blah, blah. It was really like, if you had to name it anything, my chicken and dumplings is like the one that makes them the least dirty dishes. That was my goal. So anyway, let's get to it. So there are a lot of ways you can go about making this. And I'm going to kind of talk through that as I share this recipe. Sometimes when I'm sharing a recipe, my goal is to just get the actual recipe across to you as succinctly as possible. This is one of those things that I feel like in a perfect world we would learn at our grandma's knee or our auntie's knee. So pull up a chair and join me in my kitchen, and I'm going to walk you through this process, because while I can write down this information, to be honest, I never measure this, and I think that you would lose some of the process. I've got a pot on the stove. This needs to be a pot that is large enough that you can submerge a chicken in. I will occasionally do this in a Dutch oven also. This is my favorite pot for making dumplings when I'm not making a massive batch. I use a bigger one when I'm doing 2 chickens. I have a whole chicken right here. What you can do is you could buy a rotisserie chicken from the store, pick all the meat off, simmer the bones for a while. You could add in store-bought broth. You could add in bouillon if you like using that stuff. We grew this chicken. I like making the most of it, so I prefer to make my broth from the chicken because that's cheaper than buying like external broth. You can roast the chicken first, pick the meat off, simmer the bones. What I typically do is this, and I say that, but I mean, I mix it up. I do it lots of different ways. Depends on my time, depends on what else is going on in the kitchen. But this is a really simple way to just take one chicken and make one pot of chicken and dumplings. I've got some fat that's heated up in the bottom of this pot. But before I put water over this chicken, I'm going to brown both sides of it in this pot, just because that's going to add some richness of flavor. So I just put some salt on it. There's, like, as I said, there's some oil heated up in the bottom. I'm just going to put this down. So this does not have to be perfect at all. I'm just trying to add a little color to the skin, which is going to add some depth of flavor. So I'm going to flip this over. It's stuck a little bit. Doesn't matter. It's all going in the soup. You can, of course, skip the browning step. If you roasted the chicken, you wouldn't need this. You would have that depth of flavor. If you do want to roast the chicken first, any of the juices that were like in the pan from roasting it, pour it in the pot. That's just going to be more flavor. All right, this is now had about a minute each side just to get add some color. I'm going to cover it with water. Where I said, like, I have a hard time writing this recipe down because depending on the size of your pot, you may need to put more water in to cover your chicken. You could do this with chicken leg quarters. You could do it with skin on breast and thighs and whatever chicken parts you wanted to use, you could brown and cook them covered in water. I'm usually aiming to put like a gallon to a gallon and a half of water to like one chicken, more or less. Now, I have taken one chicken and stretched it in 3 gallons of water and just let the bones simmer a long time, thrown in some bouillon or something whenever I'm trying to stretch the meat to feed a lot of people. I've done that. This isn't an exact science, but I find about a gallon to a gallon and a half of water to one chicken makes a pretty rich pot of dumplings. So I'm gonna let this simmer on the stove. I've lowered the heat to like medium low. You can dry out a chicken boiling it, even though it's in water. So after about 45 to 50 minutes of like low simmering heat, I do want to take the chicken out. Let it cool off enough that I can pick the meat off. Now, if I've got time, and let's say I'm making this in the morning for the evening, I'll take all those bones and put them back in with the meat out so it doesn't overcook. And I can let the bones simmer for a couple hours on low. It's gonna pull more collagen out and make this a richer broth. But you don't have to. It just, you know, I mean, this is something that I definitely want to encourage you guys to play with and make it your own, because with this process, there's a whole lot of wiggle room to land a pretty good pot of chicken and dumplings. And it just depends on what you've got to work with. All right, my chicken has been simmering long enough to be cooked. I don't know, an hour-ish, something like that. As I mentioned, you can dry out chicken even though it is in liquid. And if you've ever eaten really dry chicken, you know the moment it just takes all the moisture out of your mouth. It's not a great experience. We don't want to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and take this out. Now, there are a few different directions that you can go on from here. I gotta pay attention to what I'm doing or I'm gonna hurt myself. Goodness, this is thoroughly done. It's falling apart. All right, I'm gonna take all the parts out, put it in this bowl. If you want a lot of vegetable flavor in your chicken and dumplings, this is gonna be very, very subjective to opinions. You can simmer carrots and celery and onions and all of that with your chicken and then just strain it out at this point, and it'll add a lot of flavor. Personally, like a real simple chicken and dumplings, I like a good rich broth, and I don't mind if it's a little different every time. This is comfort food at its finest. It's nourishing, and it tastes like I've been making for a long time. Now, you can do a couple things. This chicken obviously has to cool enough to be picked off the bone. If you've got time, take all the bones out of the chicken and put them back here. I'm turning the heat off of this broth right now. Put them back here in the liquid. Let them simmer longer. You may have to add a little bit more water in. I typically want to have about a gallon of broth when I add my chicken back in. So some of this has simmered off. This is a product I always keep in my fridge. Now, if you're like a total real food purist, you might not want to use something like this. I like to have shortcuts sometimes. In a case that, like, let's say I don't have canned bone broth, or I don't have time to put the bones back in and let them simmer, I just put like a spoonful of this. This is organic, better than bouillon roasted chicken base. I get it at Costco, and I keep it on hand so that if I ever need to boost a broth, I can. The lighting in my kitchen leaves a lot to be desired. I'm actually going to move this over here just so I can show y'all what it looks like from just boiling a chicken for an hour, because it actually has a lot of fat and flavor already. So this is my broth as is, and that's actually good enough right here to make chicken and dumplings with. This is one of those things that, you know, when you're giving people instructions, who knows what people like? You know, some people eat like the spiciest Thai dish, and I'd be crying and like having the hiccups and having just like a visceral reaction, and they're like, meh, this isn't spicy. Whereas there are some people who you put black pepper on their food and they're like, it's so spicy. So, you know, I think this is a solid broth. If you want it richer, add something to it, simmer the bones, If you've got some jarred bone broth, you can always throw that in, you know, preference. If you have like some scuzzy bits or bits of skin or anything like that in here that bother you, you can always run this through a strainer. Pour it into another pot in a strainer. What I do, I mean, I'm just gonna be honest with y'all. I told you I'm very lazy when it comes to doing things in the kitchen. I just kind of scoop some stuff out. Y'all remember being in the above ground swimming pool when you were a child and everybody went in the same direction and made it swirl and they turned around and went in a different direction? This is what I actually do. I swirl it all in one direction and then I just put the strainer in and it catches all the stuff because it's going in the direction of the strainer. Look, it works. Do whatever you will. Strain it, don't, I don't know. It's your chicken and dumplings. All right, we're gonna put our dumplings together now. I do this in my food processor. My food processor is big and therefore it holds a lot. If you have a smaller food processor, you may need to break this down in batches, or you can totally mix this together by hand. Like, that's completely okay. I've never once measured this, so I'm gonna try to tell you about what I'm doing. I'm gonna try to write it down and hope that it is accurate enough for you to functionally mimic this. So the basis for this dumpling dough is flour, butter, and milk. And we're looking to get a certain texture that's not going to be terribly sticky and that's also not going to be super crumbly. Now, I'm going to use just regular wheat flour here. You can make this with gluten-free flour. I'm actually making this for my children to eat for dinner tonight. My husband and I are going on a date night. We do eat gluten-free. I have used multiple different gluten-free flours. I do buy like the Bob's Red Meal 1-to-1 flour. It is going to fall apart a little bit more than the regular dumplings, and you may have to tweak it a little bit and add a little extra flour to get the right texture, but it still works. Now, your dumplings, your end product, will be more, I'm saying gravy-ish, like a thicker broth, versus if you use wheat flour, it's going to be a little bit more brothy and soupy, because the dumplings do fall apart a little bit when you use the gluten-free flour, but it's still totally doable, so do keep that in mind. As I said, this is just wheat flour, and I am going to put 3 cups of flour in here. I pretty much always start with 3 cups of flour. I do about 4 tablespoons of butter into this, which I cut into a few chunks, and I'm going to whir this together to crumble the butter. So if you were doing this by hand, you could shred the butter with the cheese shredder, you could use a fork and crumble the butter into the flour. So if you like your chicken and dumplings to have a whole bunch of dumplings in them, you like it super thick, or if you're just trying to feed extra people and you're trying to stretch it, you can take this one chicken and instead of doing 1 chicken's worth of chicken with roughly, you know, a gallon or so of broth and then 3 cups of flour, double it. If you need to add more broth, add more broth. I've gone as many as like 4 batches of dumplings to 1 chicken, and I just added broth until it had the right texture. This is one of those things that's really hard to do a black and white recipe because you may have different goals. It depends on how many people I'm trying to feed. If I'm trying to feed a whole lot of people, I will do a whole lot of dumplings because it's just going to stretch my meat and it's going to be able to satisfy a lot more people. Now keep in mind, at this point, broth over there doesn't really have any seasoning in it, just a little bit of salt. So I'm going to put a few teaspoons of good salt into here. Again, this is going to come back down to preference. I'm going to put about a tablespoon of black pepper, maybe a little bit more. I usually put more in the pot also. And then I want to do about a ½ cup of fresh herbs. So I just ran out to the garden and grabbed this lovely smattering of herbs. I've got some marjoram, I've got some rosemary, I have a little bit of basil. I just planted the plant 2 days ago, so I didn't take a whole lot from it, but this is my first time cooking with fresh basil this season, so I was pretty excited about that. I have some oregano, and I have some thyme. If you don't have fresh herbs, I would say a few tablespoons of dried herbs will do the trick here. Even if you just have like an Italian seasoning, or if you've got dried basil, dried oregano, whatever you want to put in it is good. I love fresh herbs. I love using them. They're very decadent to me. They're very easy to grow, and I feel like it just elevates food. Because I'm doing this in a food processor, I'm putting whole leaves in here. I'm going to whir them together and it's going to chop it up. If you're doing this by hand, you probably want to chop these first so you don't have any really big pieces. I'm just stripping the thyme leaves off, just making sure I'm not putting any sort of like big woody bits in here. So I had turned the broth off over there because I was working on some other things. I am gonna go ahead and turn that back on. We wanna bring that to a simmer to cook our dumplings. Okay, so there's all my herbs in with the flour, which has got the butter cut in. Now, if I've got any sourdough discard, sometimes I'll throw in like a 1/4 cup of that in here. It adds just a nice tang to it. You don't have to do that, but you can if you've got it laying around. And now I'm gonna actually have to measure this milk as I put it in to tell you how much more or less that you need. Of course, this is gonna be affected by what flour you use. So this may be altered a little bit by what flour you use. I'm gonna start with a cup because I usually just mix this in until it starts taking on the texture that I want. Okay, so I had to tweak that a little bit because, as I said, I don't normally measure this. I did about 3 cups of flour, and I would tell you to do 1 3/4 cups of milk with that. I put 2 cups in. It was too wet, so I had to add some more flour in to level it out. What you want is for this to come together into a good solid dough. It's going to be a little sticky. You may need to add a little bit more flour if it's hard for you to handle it sticky like this. You can put flour on your hands. So this is where I've adjusted to not roll these out on the counter. And I can already tell you I'm probably going to do another batch of this. I'm going to get a little flour and just dust these so it's easy to handle. I don't want it super sticky. Just putting a little bit on here. Y'all, this is real deal cooking. I know it's harder to follow than having a 1, 2, 3 recipe, but like with a dish like this, there are too many variables to make it that cut and dry. It just might not always work that way, so I'd rather show you how to adjust. All right, so I just added a little bit more flour so that I can manage. We're gonna come over here. I've still got my chicken sitting there cooling off. So I have my broth in the pot that I've brought back. It's kind of boiling a little heavier. I just turned the heat down a little bit more. I wanted it a nice low simmering boil. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start pinching bits of this dough like this. And here's, if you like your dumplings a little more biscuity, you could put chunks in like this. I flatten them in my hands. So they're not rolled out thin, they're a little thicker than that, and we're just going to drop it in to that simmering broth, which is going to cook them. They'll sink down at first, and then they'll float up to the top. So if you want small pieces, you can do small pieces, you can flatten them out larger. And I will go through and drop this whole batch of dumplings in. You can see all the lovely herbs cut in there. I'm probably going to go ahead and double it and add and do the exact same thing again. I couldn't double it all at once, because my food processor can't handle that much at once. If you've got something that can, or if you're mixing them all by hand, you can start with 6 cups of flour and you do a little over 3 cups of milk with that and a cup of fresh herbs. Now, once this starts getting filled with dumplings, you may have to stir it occasionally to be able to mix these in to make sure they're falling down into the broth. But I'm going to keep this going. I'm going to put the camera on here so you guys can see. If at any point the dough starts sticking to your hands real bad, just dust it with a little more flour. Any loose flour on the outside of this dough is going to go into thickening your broth that your chicken and dumplings are in. So this is my pot with the 3-cup flour batch of dumplings. As you can see, this is still pretty soupy. There's a good deal of broth. Now, I haven't put the chicken back in yet. I'm going to put another 3-cup flour batch of dumplings in here, simply because I got 5 boys that are going to eat this for dinner, and it would be awesome if there was something left over for lunch tomorrow, so I'm just looking to make it a little more substantial. I'm going to whip that up really quick. This dough turned out just a slightly bit different. It always does, because I'm not really measuring it. If it's a little on the more like sticky side and you have to add more flour to it, this is probably a little more accurate to what I'm looking for, where it's not super sticky. But either way, you just need to be able to handle it, to break bits off, flatten them, and put them into the pot. I hope it's not overwhelming. I hope it's empowering and not overwhelming for me to be like lax about things. For me, it's encouraging. It's like, oh, there's no perfection here. There's no model of perfection. I know with some things, like I know there are things with baking and candy making, and there are some things in cooking that are very much exact sciences. But comfort food like this, just make it with love and it will be good. And usually this is exactly how I'm doing it. Just like this, I'm kind of flattening it between my fingers and my palm and making odd shapes. If you wanted to roll this dough out and cut it precisely, you could totally do that if that makes your heart happy. But I don't mind ugly food. I don't mind imperfect food. I just call it rustic, and everybody thinks that it's on purpose, not just me making shortcuts. This is raw flour. We want to cook it. It takes about 20-ish minutes of simmering for this flour to really fully cook, for these dumplings to be fully done. Again, I've got it on like medium to low heat. It's maintaining a regular simmer. I'm stirring it occasionally to make sure that my dumplings are all getting fully submerged and fully cooked. If you want veggies in this, you can throw in, at this point, frozen carrots, frozen peas. You can cut up fresh ones and put them in here, but I would just dice them small so you don't have chunky bits in. If you like the flavor of rutabagas and parsnips, they go really good in here. Now, we personally like chicken and dumplings to be real basic like this. I mean, it is a very basic comfort food with all the herbs, with all the black pepper. It's salty. It really brings out the flavor of the chicken. Now, normally this is more or less a main dish, and then we'll make something like a big green salad to go with it. So you just eat a salad and then like a bowl of chicken and dumplings, and that's dinner, because it has all these, like, it's got bread in it, so we don't ever like make bread with it or anything like that. If you like it to have like kind of a clearish broth that it's in, this is it. You don't have to do anything else. If you like it to be real gravy-ish and kind of have that thicker mouthfeel, just take some of this out and like put some in a cup and mix in a little bit of cornstarch or arrowroot powder to thicken it. A lot of times, like I mentioned, if you're using gluten-free flour, that thickens it. If you have some excess flour on the outside of your dumplings, that's going to thicken it. For feeding my family, this is about the measure of dumplings I like to have in my pot that has a gallon of broth in it. If you've got veggies that you're simmering in here and cooking in here, I wouldn't add your chicken yet. Just make sure that your veggies are getting cooked. You can just pick your chicken and put it in a bowl, and then once your veggies are cooked through and you know you're not going to have to simmer it for a whole lot longer, you can throw the chicken in. As it is, I'm only going to be simmering it for about 15 more minutes at this point to make sure the dumplings are cooked. So I'm going to go ahead and start picking this chicken off and just putting it directly in the pot. And of course, this is a whole chicken. It's going to take me just a minute. And I'm going to pick it into little bite-sized bits so that you can just eat this with a spoon. Alright, I'm almost done getting my chicken added back. You know, I was sitting here shredding this chicken thinking about it. If I were just going to the grocery store and buying meat to make this, what I used to do is I would just use chicken thighs. The skin on chicken thigh packs or quarters, because I just like dark meat more. I think it has a lot more flavor and a lot more richness when you're making something like this. The breast just, you know, it just typically seems more dry to me once it's cooked. But, you know, we grow our chickens, and so they don't come thighs only, and I typically do make most recipes with whole birds. But if you are shopping for this, that's something to keep in mind. Doing a big pack of like quarters or something like that might be a way to do this, and it may even be a little more cost effective. Now at this point, you need to taste and season your broth how you like. I usually add some salt in, at least a tablespoon or even more of black pepper. I like a lot of black pepper in chicken and dumplings. And then I put in some smoked paprika in just to add some depth to the broth. Mine looks a little different than what yours may look like. I don't know. This is whole wheat flour, so my dumplings are real kind of dark looking. But this is more or less the finished product right here. I did not add anything extra to thicken this broth. We like it like this. But as I said, you can make a slurry with some cornstarch or arrowroot powder. And as I said, I mean, this can be so customized. I mean, if you don't want your dumplings this thick, you can press them flatter, roll them out. These are a little more dense being whole wheat flour, but if you have white flour, they will be less so. And then of course, if you use the gluten-free flour, they're going to be even less dense. They're going to kind of be a little bit more falling apart. But there we have it. The ultimate comfort food. I don't know. It would be hard pressed to make that a secret recipe. It seems pretty simple to me. But that is real good, stick to your bones food. It's great on a stormy evening. It's great when you're feeling a little bit under the weather. It's great whenever you need to feed a lot of people and you just have one chicken to do it. Let me know, what do you like to do with your dumplings? I'd also be curious to know like where you're from, because I think that's probably the one factor that affects people's dumpling preference more than anything else. Thank you guys for hanging out with me in my kitchen today. I bless you. Until next time.